tell me what's going on for you and how could I help?
So getting right to it, been doing well on games, taking the flex for the very first time come June. This really kind of last ditch effort to apply for the fall. Kind of made this life decision with my wife just a few weeks before April. So June was really the only option I had before the fall. Thankfully, we've had a little more downtime, and so I've taken the time over the last 2 months to find out what the LSAT is and to get to understand what it entails, law school, and all of that. So games have been going pretty well. I think my mind kind of steers in that direction. I know it does for a lot of people. But logical reasoning and reading comprehension seem to be areas where I'm a little more at fault. Usually about 9 to 11 questions in each section incorrect. And I'm trying to figure out what is that step that I'm missing for these things to click. I understand the idea that we're supposed to find the main conclusion of the argument and find the support, find out where a lot of that connects or doesn't connect, etc. I'm trying to take that next step. I'm scoring somewhere in the 150s, mid to upper, lower, depending on the week. What is that next step I need to take to really push myself into the 160 area?
Sure. Well, let me ask you this regarding logical reasoning. What does your question review process look like?
Yeah, and that was another part. That was going to be the next part of my question. I'm going back through a blind review, taking those questions that I did get incorrect, turning back around, reviewing those stimuli, and really trying to think about where I made the misstep. And usually I'm doing much better on a blind review with no time constraint. I'm seeing the same thing over at reading comprehension as well. So time constraint, I'm thinking, is a bit of a factor in there. You know, the stress that happens when you see the ticker ticking down. But there is definitely a hole in that process. So I'm looking for the best advice you can give me on blind review, on understanding those questions, and how best to take that next step.
Sure. Well, I'm actually going to take it in a little bit of a different direction and share with you another review strategy that I've developed called the Socratic review method.
Okay.
And this really involves, and I have much more on this on the YouTube channel you can search, but basically the idea is that we're continually asking questions to get to the root of where your misunderstanding stemmed from. In logical reasoning, for example, you would ask, what about the stimulus gave you trouble? Was it that the conclusion was buried in the middle? Was it that there were annoying indicator words like unless, except, until, without? Were there no indicator words at all? Did you have to take contrapositives and link things together? Was the topic difficult? It could be any variety of things, but you got to figure out what about the stimulus gave you trouble, because it really does. A lot of it, at least, starts there. If you don't understand the argument, looking at the choices won't help you further. They'll only further confuse you.
Right.
With the question stem, there may be things like unfamiliar wording, but assuming that you've got a good sense of what the question type is, we have to look at the stimulus in depth as well as the answer choices in depth. And for the answer choices, you got to see what was tempting about the wrong answer that made you pick it and made it seem appealing, and what ultimately made it wrong. And what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct. So you have these traps of discouragement away from the right answer and traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer.
Right.
And so that's the kind of analysis that you've got to do. And blind review, a lot of that is timed versus untimed, but regardless, a deep understanding is going to be important.
Right. I appreciate that. I'm making some quick notes here, so I make the most of our time. So let's say I'm going through my blind review through reading comprehension. I seem to be doing very well, and this is especially the case in my practice testing and in my review. I do very well in all sections, especially in the first passages or the first game. I'm sure that they're front loading probably the easier portions of those sections. How do I, through that time, as I get into the second and third and fourth games, passages, and quarters of that LR section, number one, endurance. How do I keep my focus throughout that time? And number two, should I change the order in which I approach the test, maybe front loading the harder questions? What's your strategy there?
Sure. So endurance, it's like a muscle. You get stronger by doing it more. So I would be doing lots of timed sections, lots of timed exams. Endurance as a whole is actually less important for flex because you're only doing 3 sections, not 5. But simulate test day, get as many 3-section exams under your belt as possible for the flex so that it'll be just another run through on test day.
Right.
So that's the only way I can think of to build is by doing it. When it comes to order of approach, on average, I would do things in the order given. There's a cost in terms of jumping around, like doing the 4th game before the 3rd game. And I would never do the harder questions first because everything's worth the same. Within a game or within a passage, you might do the questions associated with that game or passage out of order. But I wouldn't look to do, if you're planning to solve all 4 games or all 4 passages anyway, I don't see a lot of value in skipping one only to come back to it.
Gotcha.
But your mileage may vary. Try it out if you think it might help.
Sure. Now, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to take the opportunity to ask you, for a person that's scoring in the 150s on a pretty consistent basis, really kind of been stuck in that area, is there a thing that with all the students you've trained and you've tutored over the years, is there a factor that you see a commonality between the students that are scoring in the 150s and are really having trouble to get out of there, and the students that are improving from the 150s into the 160s and beyond?
Yeah, sure. So I think 150s to 160s involves becoming proficient in the strategies for all sections and all question types. Then 160s to 170s involves a deeper analysis to understand why the strategies work. In cases where there are formulas, why do the formulas work? How were they derived and developed? And then becoming obsessed with knowing everything they can about this exam. So including what goes into constructing it, what goes into the various difficulty levels of different questions. I also have personally, of course, been obsessed with this exam, as you might gather, and I befriended a former writer of actual LSAT questions. And I conducted written interviews with him. I conducted video and podcast interviews with him as well. And I'd recommend checking those out because there's nothing like getting it straight from the horse's mouth and seeing his perspective, even just the way he talks like an LSAT question. There's something about that precision, that detail, that depth. And so I recommend looking at those. I've done a few videos with him and a series of written interviews with him as well. And we go into what is involved in making this exam and creating it. And so just developing an interest in psychometrics in general, the science of standardized exams, is really interesting. And the more you can learn about this exam, the better you'll do.
Beautiful. Steve, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I don't know any more specific questions that I prepared. We moved pretty quickly through them. Is there any advice you would offer kind of beyond that area?
Well, since we were talking about question review, I'm going to send you a link to that video about question review, the Socratic review method, so that you can get more of the details related to it and some other ideas around reviewing in general. Because I think that, especially in the final weeks, there's not as much foundational work to do as there is in-depth review and timed exams. And the stuff on understanding the exam on a deeper level, you can look at that and obviously consume it in a day if you want to. But the more time that you have to let it sink in, the more of an impact it'll have. And so I would definitely look at it today and keep it in mind over the next couple of weeks. And then if you end up retaking it beyond June, you might have more time to do that sort of analysis and research that I talked about.
Beautiful. Well, I look forward to that.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.